So I'm Katie Miller. I'm very happy to be here. So, Lori's kept me busy with random things she's finding in the coffers of the trust. When she contacted me about doing a table talk, I said, okay, sure, I can talk about some bodies and things. And, I touch on Pensacola a little bit. I do some work with the Miraflores Cemetery, some other cemeteries in town, when Lori finds skeletons quite literally in closets. And so I handle anything that is older than 75 years. So anything that is still has medical legal significance goes to our forensic offices and the medical examiners. But anything earlier than that falls to me, which can be a lot in a place like Pensacola where we have such a long history. So when she asked me to do this talk, I've worked with John Worth a little bit on hypothesizing what the Luna Cemetery would look like if we ever found it. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. But I wanted to kind of show you what Spanish colonialism looks like in other places and to think about how we might model what might occur in Pensacola should we ever find that cemetery. So there's a couple different things, a couple caveats that would come from this. There are going to be pictures of human remains. Go, it's okay.
I'm so sorry.
Please, come in, it's fine. Go ahead, cross through. So there are human remains from Mesoamerica shown in this presentation. And so these are not subject to NAGPRA. There's a little bit of a different belief system and perspective on the study of human remains. So these are all used with permission from Mexico and Guatemala, okay? And their institutes of archaeology. So what we're trying to do as bioarchaeologists is a couple different things. So I'm trying to reconstruct essentially what is the lived experience. What was your life like in the past, and what was your life like, what can we determine and understand? I think this one is my camera. Guys that are coming quietly. It's okay. It's right here. This is my brother. Okay. It's okay. My sister. Hi. Okay. So part of what we do is trying to reconstruct the lived experience by thinking about how the human body integrates different components of who you are into your skeletal and dental tissues. So we can see this a couple of different ways. The biogeochemistry that Philip brought up, right? Excellent job, right? We use a lot of statistics and mathematical models, and then skeletal analysis. So most recently, I did my dissertation in Copan, which is sort of all the way down here in Honduras. But since then, I've been pulled into a couple different sites that are where we're dealing with things like colonialism and imperialism. So a little bit more historic perspectives. We're talking about, 1692. We're talking about Luna settlement in the 16th century, etc. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these: Taizal, Guatemala, Xaltocan, Mexico, and I'll bring up potentially what Pensacola might have if John ever finds that cemetery, which I hope he does. He really wants to. And we've talked about it and dreamed about it and posited, because it could answer a lot of the really pending questions that he has about the Luna expedition. So, it's a pretty big span of, Central America and Mexico that I spend my time, and I am typically there for about 3 months every year, at least. So when I'm reconstructing the lived experience as a bioarchaeologist, which means that I am both a biological anthropologist studying skeletons, evolution, but also archaeology. So I go and dig square holes, I live in the jungle, I do all that fun stuff that typical archaeologists do. But what we're doing is we're thinking about the human body in ways that we have an archaeological understanding of the human body, where the biological aspects of who you are shaped by the cultural processes in the environment in which you're living. And so one of my favorite books, which Jenna knows because I've talked about this before, is So Fair. And this is a book that's thinking about how the body is a form of material culture in the same way that we have like ceramic data or lithic data. So your skeleton documents your life in all the same sort of ways. So one thing that she says is archaeological practice cannot divide the physical, social, or individual's body into discrete boxes, since each is dependent on the other. They are different facets of the same phenomenon, and archaeologists must make living bodies out of those that are dead. And this is really what we're trying to do. You're trying to understand somebody's experience. You're trying to give them essentially their voice back. It's very appropriate that we're in the Voices building today, right? But we're thinking about how all of these things can impact and affect your life. So things like your gender, your sex, your occupation, things that are social processes like sexism or racism or marginalization or colonialism. These are all things that can mark your skeletal tissues. But we do this in a couple ways. So this is from one of our classic textbooks where we teach students osteology. And here you can see the different forms of our bones. So these are male and female pelvis, os coxa, as we call them, cranial bones, and teeth. And we think about how teeth wear down over the course of our life and how that can tell us about age and diet and all kinds of other things. We also then think about genetic traits. And these are what we call non-metric traits that we can sort of model and measure and look at their form and their shape to tell us about the underlying genotype that's expressed as your phenotype. So what you look like is based on your genetics, and we can just look at that morphology to kind of get at some of that genetic information. We spend a lot of time looking at teeth because teeth are often very well preserved, especially in these really tropical environments like the jungle. We don't get soft tissue, right? We don't get cloth, we don't get wood or anything like that. I mean, it's very similar to what we have in Florida here. You've all seen the poor possum on the side of the road that's there for a very short time period, right? That's because decay is very quick here. So these are just some examples of that funny little things that we have in our bones and our teeth. We can also then look at isotopic data. So we have two kinds, stable and radiogenic. Stable isotopes are those that wind up in our through diet. So this is carbon, which is going to tell us how much corn you were eating, or beans, or things like that. Nitrogen will tell us how much shellfish you were eating, seafood, terrestrial mammals. And so we can reconstruct diet using all of these, and we can then map it back to some of these things like the Florentine Codex that has some documentation of what the Spanish said that these indigenous peoples were eating, okay? I will give you a little bit of a spoiler is that the Spanish documentation is very creative in terms of its veracity and in terms of if they are actually documenting what they're observing. The other thing that we do that's really kind of fun is strontium isotope analysis. So this is where we can isolate just strontium, which replaces for calcium in your dental tissues. And we can pull that out using all these laboratory methods. And I can tell where you were born and raised, and then what materials you were putting into your teeth during that time period. Then we can compare it to where you're buried. And so we can interpret migration events and understand a little bit more about what's happening. So it's just in groundwater and food, and there's all these different geological zones. This is Honduras, it's really diverse. And then when we're comparing it, trying to think about migration of, for example, the Luna settlement or some of these other Spanish conquistador types, we're trying to match it back to Europe, which has pretty basic geology as well. But one of the caveats always that I give is that we have to understand that what we're excavating as archaeologists is always a subsample of what the lived population was. So we try to make these really big inferences, but we have to sometimes pull back a little bit and say, you know, the reality of this is people were buried, right? Some of them are recovered. There might be taphonomic changes, right? Post-depositional burial environment changes that affect that, and then ultimately what we actually recover and can analyze. So I want to give you just a little bit about sort of my approach to doing this. So I take a biocultural approach, and that biocultural approach thinks about embodiment, how things are actually pulled into your skeletal tissues. So how the social becomes biological, right? Cortisol levels can affect how you grow. Did you have poverty during childhood? These are all things that are going to show up in your skeletal tissues, whether you like it or not. And so we've been working on something called structural vulnerability at UWF in our biocultural lab, where we are considering how these things can happen in forensic contexts, archaeological contexts, and then in contemporary social contexts. Now, I have a picture of my daughter here, right? This is when she was in Honduras with me for Dia de Niños. She did kindergarten down there when I was doing my Fulbright. And when I was making this presentation, I was looking for pictures of kids, and I was like, I have a kid, I'll put a picture of my kid, right? So here she is. But what's interesting here, especially at Chateau Khan, I'll talk about them a lot, is Chateau Khan has about 66% of the skeletal sample is juveniles, so adolescents or children. That's an unusually high number. And so when I was looking at that skeletal sample, I was thinking, you know, children are really essential to trying to reconstruct, especially these periods of colonialism or imperialism, because they're the first ones to die, they're the first ones to be most acutely affected. And if we understand what's happening to them, we're going to understand more likely what's happening to society, because to become an adult, you have to survive childhood. And so if you're not surviving childhood, then we're understanding that there's some disruption that's happening in the course of that experience. Okay, so I thought about this initially as like canaries in the coal mine. You guys have all heard that phrase before, right? So canaries in the coal mine, they were really, this 19th and 20th century, they were used actually in mining contexts, and their song was indicative of safety or insecurity in that mining context, because what was happening is they were actually having, they were there to mark when things became toxic before it would affect the miners. And in some ways, that's what we're seeing with the children. So the environment is so acutely bad that they are no longer surviving into adulthood. So in that way, children in the archaeological record are the first ones to experience that sociopolitical change. They're the first ones to experience violence, inequality, and if they survive into adulthood. So there's studies of this right now in contemporary contexts with the New York Times, etc. But let's model this now for 15th century Mexico. So the site is called Xaltocan, and it had a double whammy. It experienced Aztec imperialism in the 15th century, and the Aztecs were only around for about 100 years, so it was a pretty short empire. And then they had Spanish colonialism in the 15th century, or 16th century right after that. And so what I was able to do is compare Aztec imperialism to Spanish colonialism and say, who was worse? Okay? It was the Spanish. Okay? I'll tell you that. Look at the data now. But Xaltocan is a small village, and this was when Tenochtitlan was the major city in the middle of Mexico, the Aztec capital, and there was a huge lake. They had the chinampas. They had all these fabulous ways that they were living and adapting to the central Mexican valley. And eventually, the lake is now drained. It's now just a lake bed, and so we don't have an idea fully of how easily these areas communicated or not. But here's Tenochtitlan. So for them to come up to here to Xaltocan, which was an island community at the time, was not out of bounds, right? This was really not too far away for them. This is now basically right under the center of Mexico City, if that gives you an idea of how close or far this may be. So what the Spanish did is they built this church, the Xaltocan 16th century church, as soon as they came into Xaltocan. And what we found is that with my colleagues, Kristen De Lucia and Enrique Rodriguez de Uria, is that they did the GPR mapping of this, and they looked at heat mapping around the church, trying to identify where people were potentially buried to understand what happened at this location at this time. And so there was Aztec burials basically right here, right here, right here, and then within the bounds of the church, that's where we see all of the Spanish effects. Okay, so what we found, this was really interesting. So it was excavated in really complex ways. So the Spanish didn't bury their dead in this church as we bury our dead. It wasn't in nice, neat rows, right? That would make it too easy. At this church, they used ossuaries, so they were burying their dead, sometimes digging them up, and then putting them in big pits, which are just massive amounts of commingled bones. So there was 11 different contexts that were actually burials that included about 14 individuals, 4 infants, 3 children that were just aged 3 to 5, an adolescent, and about 6 adults. So that's a little bit unusual, and this kind of gives you an idea of the depth. This is 2.5 meters. So this is a pretty deep excavation in terms of how many burials are here. There was 2 ossuaries. One had just 5 individuals, and the other had 29, including 20 children. Okay. There was a bunch of isolated contexts that were just pieces that, when they were excavating new graves, they would just go through somebody's legs or head or arms and move them to another spot. Right? Very different than what we would do now. But 32 of the 48 individuals that were in these 11 contexts, 2 ossuaries, were children and adolescents. And to give you an idea, that's a very unusual demographic pattern. Normally we would see very old individuals. It's that bell curve of normal death. Very old individuals, maybe some adults, maybe some young adults that were dying in childbirth or things like that, warfare, and then children that were dying early in childhood during weaning or early diseases. This is indicating that something was very seriously wrong. And so this was the cemetery that I got there, and I had to figure out how all of these different bones and people were oriented from some of the different photos. So these are all of the burials, okay? And you can see that some of them are partial, some are overlaying others. And we'll talk about a couple individuals in particular, including this one that I've highlighted here, okay? I don't know why I highlighted it twice. So then I had to go through and think about different time periods, because it looks like the oldest burials were the very deepest, and the most recent were the ones that were the most superficial. So these were the most superficial individuals, okay? This was the next layer down, and these are, and you can think about how these are associated. And then these were the very deepest ones, and you can tell that they've been very much disturbed. So this is what the excavations actually looked like, and you can understand the complexity of trying to unravel all of these different vertical and horizontal layers to reconstruct their relationships. But I want to just show you a little bit. So this individual, you can sort of see the orientation here, right? So this one. I'm so accustomed to seeing this as an archaeologist, so maybe you're looking at it and going, I don't see it, but it's there. This case was very unusual because this might not look like much, right? There's a leg, there's a torso, and but the story that's being told by this person is much more profound. So she was disturbing, this person is female, disturbing the leg of another individual. So when I was going through the bones that were associated with that excavation, I found that she was very likely pregnant with a almost full-term baby. And it doesn't look like it was like dying in childbirth. It was a little bit too early for that. But what was interesting is that she was well within her 40s at the time. So that's telling us something too about the health of the society. We're seeing, fecundity still, right? That fertile period extending well into your 40s, especially when life expectancy might only be 55 or 60, right? Which is kind of wild to think about in these prehistoric periods. Okay, so there she is. And this is what these ossuaries look like. So when I say it was just collections of bones, this is really what it looked like. And this is where we found a lot of the children and a lot of the individuals that were mixed together. And so what it looks like is that they were digging pits and or putting people's bones into bags, which are not preserved anymore, and placing them in corners of this cemetery. And so the archaeologists I was working with really wanted to know how many people were here, what were their ages at death, and what is this telling us about what happened. Okay, so this is all in this corner down here. The other thing that was interesting is a lot of them have shovel marks on them. So these are marks not from trauma, but this is from the exhumation of them in the 16th century as they were burying these other individuals within the cemetery. And there's a couple things that are interesting, is that these are marks that are sort of indiscriminate, and they are just going right through these burials without necessarily caring about who's there, right? Which is different than how we think of our mortuary programs. They also had lots of different diseases and indicators of really hard labor. This is what a lower back looks like when you start to have repetitive stress, fractures, you develop these things called osteophytes. If your lower back hurts, you might have something that looks like this, okay? This is a young child that has a depression fracture, and this is from the butt of a sword, okay? So this is, and there was a couple other individuals that had sharp force trauma and trauma that looks like it was Spanish weapons perpetuated against the indigenous people within this family. So this child is only about 6 years old. Now this case was one of the ones that made me a little bit sadder to think about. So what you have here is this is an adult woman, and she had a really unusual skeletal marker. Remember I told you about those non-metrics? So she had something that's called an Inca bone, and she had a tripartite Inca bone. I've looked at thousands of skeletons. I've seen this one time, and it was her, right? This kid had the same thing. The kid on the other side of her had the exact same thing. These were her kids. Genetically, it's not possible or probable that these were not, because they had the exact same genetic features. Now, the thing that was sort of tragic about this as well is that none of them had any skeletal lesions that we could say, yes, this person had a long, prolonged disease. They were really really sick for a long time. They had malnutrition. They all died very quickly from some disease. And a lot of these diseases that we know after Spanish colonialism were very short-lived, and they were often brought by the Spanish. And so these indigenous peoples were affected quite acutely, and it could wipe out entire villages. And that's exactly what we think happened in her case. She was buried just slightly lower than them, so it looks like she was the first to die, and then her children followed shortly thereafter. And that's something that we see that occurs in these contexts, right? So when we talk about Spanish colonialism, it's not just settling and coming into a place. I mean, this is interactions between people that are benefiting some and costing others everything, okay? So what I did find, though, at this site was that the skeletal remains for those that were subject to the Aztec imperialism, they didn't have diseases. Their lifespan was normal. I don't see this violent trauma, despite all of the myth that we have about the bloodthirsty Aztecs cutting off heads and throwing them down. The feathers are repaired, right? That's not what we observed here at all. It looks like the the Aztec came in, conquered them, extracted tribute. So they taxed them, but they let them keep their homes, they let them keep their lives, they let them keep their food. The Spanish, it was something else. It was violence, right? We see very clear violence on the bones. We see some traumatic lesions, even on children. So this is telling us that this Spanish sort of colonialism was in some ways excessive labor, excessive force, and disease, right? It's not a happy story, but it's an important story to tell because this runs counter to a lot of the documentation that we see from the Spanish saying, oh yes, we're so magnanimous. They love us, we are converting them to Christianity, and it is going great, or whatever the case may be. And so the difference between these two were quite marked. All right. So I want to talk now about the Spanish and the Itzal Maya. So this is and we're now moving into Guatemala, so not the Aztec anymore in central Mexico. And this is the end of the 17th century into the start of the 18th century, so about 1690 to 1740. So what happened with, I get to work here, not too shabby, okay? So we get to live in this little island and do research on there's archaeological sites all around this lake, but this is Lake Petenitza. And Lake Petenitza was a really rich environment. The waterways served as basically the highways of the past, so this was a very good place to live. You can tell that this has a lot of Spanish influence, yes? Okay. Now I want you to notice how green this is up here. This is right where the site is. And this is what the Spanish reported about this location, right? This is showing after they razed all of the fields. They burned down the jungle, right? And there's Maya documentation of this, but not Spanish documentation of this, because it was a very clear strategy that the Spanish were using. So the Itzal Maya were quite unique because they were the very last Maya group to be conquered by the Spanish. I mean, 1690 is really late. And they fought and they fought and they fought and they fought. And they kept the Spanish away for a very long time. But the Spanish eventually got in. They set up their fort here, which is the island that is now Flores. This church is still standing, right, even from the 17th century. But what used to be a really beautiful site here, an archaeological site, was renamed San Bernabe, Saint Bernard, I guess, Bernard. But San Bernabe was they changed the name of the city of Tayasal, the Itzal Maya, into San Bernabe, and they built a mission right on top of the biggest pyramid of the Tayasal site. And this is something the Spanish did over and over again. So, predictably, somebody decided to drive a bulldozer in this area to build a new road. This is how archaeological sites are often found. So they wanted to build a new road. They started driving their bulldozer. You can see there's one existing road here. This is in a protected national park now. So they were just saying, oh, we need another access point up from the beach. And they drove right through what is structure T31. And this was the mission. This was the Spanish church that the Spanish built on top of the Maya site. And as soon as they drove this bulldozer through, oh my gosh, there's human remains coming out from in front of my bulldozer. So that's how this cemetery was found, totally by happenstance. And this is the excavation of us sort of taking this on in the jungles in Guatemala. Now, they were buried in very neat rows, which is something we see with these late mission sites. So slightly different than what we saw in Mexico, which was one of those early mission sites, which is sort of Harkening back more to like the catacombs, those French catacombs, these sort of ossuaries where bones were just sort of moved around quite regularly. Here we had about 47 individuals, and lifespan was quite short again, right? Adult 35 to 50, we only have about 15. I don't have anybody that's older than 50. Do you think that's a short life? Some of you are older than 50. I'm approaching 50. That feels really young still, right? I feel like that's, you're just getting going, right? That is, we're seeing people die, again, really, really young. Most of the people who are dying were dying by 35. And again, we see this big uptick in children between 3 and 12. Those aren't normal ages to be dying, right? Especially given the sort of demographics that we see here, okay? Now, these were really, really fragmented. And you'll notice that a lot of them had extra burial bones in them. This is something that the Maya would do. So here, it looks like they had sort of one religious figure who was sort of there in charge, but most of these burials were being done by the Itzá Maya of the other Itzá Maya. So when they were burying their dead, they were putting the bones in patterns in the same way that the Maya did in prehistoric periods. They were including bones of grandmothers and grandfathers in the burials with their dead. They were putting them in position so they could see each other. It was all very subversive in that way. Fine, we'll bury them in your Christian church, we'll bury them in this pattern, but we're going to do it our way. Okay? Now, with this one, it's a kind of a different story. So their strategy at this mission was starvation. And that's why they burned all of the fields. And we have documentation of some of this from Maya folks who were writing things down, or some Spanish accounts saying, yes, we burned all the fields, we burned all the crops. Because then if you have no other food choice, and the only place you can get it is the mission, and your family's starving, what are you going to do? Right? You might fold. You might say, okay, fine, I'll convert, I'll become part of this church. So all of these lesions are indicative of deficiencies that are stemming from vitamins. And they show up in a couple different ways: losing your teeth, having these lesions that show up on your long bones, especially on your legs. There's lots of back trauma. And then this is a classic thing called parrot swelling of a child that's about 3 years old who was very, very, very sick when they died. So what's causing this? This person's losing their teeth. Those are good, healthy teeth, right? What do you think? Why am I showing you oranges? Go ahead and say it.
Scurvy.
It's scurvy. It's scurvy in the jungles of Central America, where you have chilies and fruits, and really they have exploited this environment beautifully for thousands of years. I've never, ever, ever seen scurvy in a Maya person until here. We also then did some isotopic work on them with that carbon that I told you about to look at corn. Their diet at the end of their life went to like a 95% unenriched corn diet. So they were only eating corn whole. There was no longer, we don't have any indicators of fruit or vegetables or legumes or good proteins that are being integrated into the diet. And we always think of scurvy as like the sailor's disease, right? But the important thing about scurvy for us to consider is that it can happen in 3-4 months. The time of a sea voyage is the time it takes for somebody to potentially succumb to this. Now, it's easy to fix. You just need some vitamin C, right? And I won't get into all the clinical manifestations of this, but these are the lesions I was observing on the bones. I know these are really gross, right? But think about this whole society was suffering from this en masse. Your teeth fall out too young, you start to have, your skin starts to look pale, you suffer a lot, your organs start to shut down. It's a terrible disease to die of. Now, on top of that, I did some genetic research on them using dentomorphology, right? Those different traits that we see. The folks buried on this side of the cemetery are related to those buried in this part of the cemetery. This is the earliest part of the cemetery. This is the latest part of the cemetery. What we're seeing is generations of, these are the grandparents, these are their children, these are their grandchildren. And eventually you see, so that if they targeted the patriarchs or the matriarchs of the family, okay? And then we see them bring their families into this fold, into the cemetery. And then we have a really bad period of when scurvy starts. You can see it sort of calm down a little bit. So here's the first pass, right, of everybody having scurvy. So this is when the Spanish were first cutting down the fields and things like that. Things sort of settled, and we have the temporal maps for this as well. But people are still dying in pretty high numbers. We know that there was a very late, about 1720 uprising by the Maya folks, and then look what we have again, scurvy again. So there was 2 waves of this, so they implemented this strategy, we think, more than once, to try to get them to behave. Okay. I should have warned you, it's not like a particularly uplifting story. Now, maybe Luna's different, all right? So what might we expect at Luna? Here's this image of Luna and his soldiers here. And we know that there was Aztec members in that crew with Luna. We know that there were all kinds of different folks that were integrated into the Luna expedition. And we all know that, I mean, what would have happened if the hurricanes hadn't come? What would have happened? Hi. You came in so quietly. Like a mouse. Okay. So what would have happened if they had been successful? Would we have seen the same sort of interaction between the tribal groups here in the southeast with Luna and the folks, or would there have been some buffering between this because we did have Aztec individuals, or would it have just been another version of Aztec and Spanish colonialism that would have taken place here? Now, you know, we have all of these ideas of these Spanish settlements and explorations that happened here, and the Spanish were just busy at this time. They were kind of all over the place. But Tristan de Luna is right here, and of course, you know, this is us in Pensacola. And, you know, they fled, we know, to the north. And those of you who are familiar with Dr. Worth's work, you know a lot of this story already, so I won't get too much into it. But we do have some ideas based on objects that have been found. We know that there's Aztec ceramics here. We know that there's Aztec food systems. We find ceramics and all of these things that are supporting this idea that they might have been practicing sort of Aztec lifestyles as well as Spanish lifestyles. So that would follow that we should be able to then look at their bones and look at their migration, their point of origin. We can also look at their diet. We can also look at their health to reconstruct what that lived experience was for the Aztecs versus the Spanish. And, you know, but things started okay. Things were okay. And then they were not. Okay, so that's what we know that happened in the settlement with Luna. And they, you know, they tried to recover, but ultimately we all know that they abandoned it. And this all happened in the span of just about 2 years. And so we know that there's going to be a lot of people who probably perished, whether they were part of the ships in the hurricanes or whether they had some sort of effect afterward. So it's hypothetical at this point, but it's kind of interesting to think about. What we think that the churches might have looked like at this time, they probably were similar to what I saw at San Bernabe, these sort of smaller structures, ideas of, this is one that we think might be sort of similar, these sort of stick open churches, so we'd be looking just for like post holes and individuals that were interred. Sometimes it's a little bit more formal. You know, it's just interesting to kind of think about what this might look like. But what we do see in these later periods that were sort of analogous with what we see with Luna is that individuals would have been buried in sort of row-ish structures, right? They're kind of straight. My OCD doesn't like this. I want to see like nice rows and a grid system. But this is pretty much what we see. But you can also imagine though, if we have, and you can even see there's some age differences here, right? So these little skeletons are the small children. So we might see some bias of just those that are donating, that are closer to the nave, those that are children might be outside, etc. So that's just a little bit on Spanish colonialism and imperialism at some different sites and what that might mean. So I welcome any questions if you have any. Gabby and Jenna, you're free. You don't have to ask any questions. You already know. You've already asked a lot of those things. So unless you have something that's burning, you've heard some of this before. But yeah, even if it's like the hypothetical Luna ideas, it's kind of interesting to think about because, you know, John's really interested in trying to understand like how many people were on these boats? What were their lives like? Were the Aztec people enslaved or were they agents of their own that had a degree of power within these settlements. And we could answer that with just a couple teeth. If it's ever found. If it's not, it's okay too, right? We can hypothetically approach this. So any questions? Are you horrified by the Spanish a little bit? Are you surprised? That's what I should ask instead. Yeah, oftentimes students are like, yeah, I'm not surprised. But this isn't what they were writing home about. And that's one of the interesting things that the bioarchaeological data has shown, is that it's not, what they said they did and what they did are two different things. But that's not a surprise, to me at least. Right. Well, thanks. I hope it was an interesting lunchtime for you. Thanks for coming.